Our talk this evening is entitled Becoming Empty for God. And it is based on books 2 and 3 of the Ascent of Mount Carmel, where St. John of the Cross describes the active purification of the intellect, the memory, and the will necessary for union with God. Right now you have completed almost 3 full days into your retreat, and at this point you may be asking yourself, especially if this is your first week-long intensive retreat, whatever possessed me to sign up for this retreat? Or what on earth does watching the breath, or working with body sensations, or entering into a painful spot in my body, what on earth does that have to do with union with God or the following of Jesus Christ? And because I know some of you are asking yourselves these questions, I think it would be helpful first to review again exactly what it is we're trying to do on this retreat, and then move into speaking more specifically about becoming empty for God. So what, again, is the purpose of the retreat? We are really trying to do here exactly what St. John of the Cross was trying to do when he wrote the Ascent of Mount Carmel. Listen to how he describes his purpose on the opening page of the Ascent, right under the book's title. He writes, "This treatise explains how to reach divine union quickly. It presents instruction and doctrine valuable for beginners and proficients, or those making progress in contemplative prayer alike, that they may learn to unburden themselves of all earthly things, avoid spiritual obstacles, and live in that complete nakedness and freedom of spirit necessary for divine union." End quote. Like John of the Cross, we want to help you achieve union with God quickly. But it's important to understand what John means by God, by union with God, and by achieving divine union quickly. First, then, who is God? What is God? God, John writes, is simply mystery. God is incomprehensible goodness. God is immanent in the sense that God is always present within our lives in the very depths of our being. And yet, at the same time, God is transcendent, beyond our capacity to capture him completely in a thought, in a memory, in an emotional experience. And God is present within us, continually inviting us to draw closer to him in an embrace of love. If a person is seeking God, John says, God the Beloved is seeking the person much more. So God is mystery. God is immanent, that is present within us, and yet transcendent. And God is inviting us continually to loving union with himself. And what precisely does union with God mean? To begin with, John of the Cross insists that we are always united with God. Just to be alive, to be breathing, is to be united with God. He writes in Book 2 of the Ascent of Mount Carmel, "God sustains every person and dwells in that person substantially, even though he or she may be the greatest sinner in the world. This union between God and creatures always exists. By it, God conserves their being, so that if that union would end, they would immediately be annihilated and cease to exist. John calls this union of the human person with God substantial union. It always exists, even though we are not aware of it. There is nothing we can do to achieve it. It is simply a given of our life. It is there. It's a gift of God's incomprehensible goodness. You might say it's the gift of life itself and the continuing sustenance or being sustained in life. However, there is another union with God which exists when God's will and the human person's will are in conformity, so that nothing in the one is repugnant to the other. When the person completely rids itself of what is repugnant and unconformed to the divine will, it is transformed in God through love. John calls this union a union of likeness. In contrast to the substantial union, it is not always existing between the human person and God, but is present only when there is a likeness of love. And although this union of likeness is also a gift of God's incomprehensible goodness, it nonetheless requires great sustained effort on our parts to dispose ourselves for this gift of union. It is this union of likeness, centered in love, that is the divine union John is speaking of when he attempts to lead his readers to union with God quickly. To explain this union a little more further, John uses the image of sun shining through a window. And through this image, he tries to explain the union of likeness. The window and the sun are two different realities. If the window is dirty and smudgy, you see the difference between the window and the sun. But if the window is totally clean and all the smudges are gone, the sunlight and the window seem to be one, even though they are and remain separate. But when the window is perfectly clean, the sunlight so transforms and illumines it that to all appearances, the window is identical with the ray of sunlight, as anyone can attest who has walked smack into a glass sun-porch door which is perfectly clean and pure. You end up with a severe bruise on your forehead. Another image of this union of likeness is two ballroom dancers, like the dancers we sometimes see in the Lawrence Welk show or in other ballroom dancing. As they glide across the floor, twisting, twirling, dipping, there appears perfect harmony between them. Their wills are conformed to each other throughout the dance, just as with persons united with God in a union of likeness. Their life with God is like a dance, a movement in complete harmony and union of wills with God. For John, the spiritual life is simply the journey from our substantial union with God to the union of likeness. And I find it consoling to realize, on the one hand, that I am always united with God. I can never be apart from God or never be separated from God. And yet also challenging to realize that I am invited to be transformed into God's very own life through love. And this is the divine union John wants to lead us to quickly. And what does he mean by showing us how to reach this union of likeness with God quickly? Certainly he has no magic formula that gives us union with God without effort. We keep looking for one, but they're simply not there. He has nothing of that to teach us. Rather, he is showing us the most direct way to union with God by teaching us how to unburden ourselves of earthly things, to avoid roadblocks on the journey to God, and to live in that complete nakedness and freedom of spirit necessary for divine union. John shows us the quickest way to divine union because he shows us the most direct way. And now let us see specifically what John means by living in complete nakedness and freedom of spirit and becoming empty for God. In books 2 and 3 of the Ascent of Mount Carmel, John teaches that the quick and direct way to union with God is not through a particular religious experience, extraordinary interior phenomena, intense emotions or feelings, or deep and profound insights, but rather in simple faith, hope, and love. And this is because God is present within us, not as a thought or a feeling or an image or a memory, but as transcendent mystery, as incomprehensible goodness. God simply transcends or is beyond our capacity to capture or to possess him in a thought, an image, or an emotion. John writes, "To attain union with God, a person should advance neither by understanding, nor by the support of his own experience, nor by feeling or imagination, but by belief in God's being. For God's being cannot be grasped by the intellect, appetite, or imagination, or any other sense, nor can it be known in this life. The most that can be felt and tasted of God in this life is infinitely distant from God and the pure possession of God." End quote. The journey to union with God in this life is, therefore, a journey in darkness, an emptying or letting go of our attachments to specific thoughts, images, and feelings about God, who is beyond our human comprehension and beyond our human capacities to feel, to imagine, or to conceive God as God truly is. We journey to God, as John says, by unknowing rather than by knowing. And of course you can recognize in that terminology the whole tradition in the church that is expressed in a book like The Cloud of Unknowing, which has many cross-references with the writings of St. John of the Cross, as Father Johnston pointed out in his edition of The Cloud of Unknowing. Becoming empty of attachments to thoughts, to images, and to feelings about God, however, does not create a vacuum within us. Rather, it simply disposes us to be filled with God's loving knowledge, which transforms our entire being into union with God. John writes, "Since this transformation and union is something that falls beyond the reaches of the senses and of human capability, the soul must empty itself perfectly and voluntarily, I mean in its affection and will, of all earthly and heavenly things it can grasp. It must, through its own effort, empty itself, insofar as it can. As for God, who will stop God from accomplishing his desires in the person that is resigned, annihilated, and despoiled?" End quote. Thus, to the degree that we empty ourselves in faith of attachments to all that is not God, to that degree does God unite us with himself. And when our emptiness is complete, our union with God is perfect. our transformation in him is complete. And when St. John talks of being transformed in God, he means that we participate fully in God's life. Our lives have become so changed from our ordinary way of perceiving, judging, and reacting to persons and situations that we now actually see all life as God sees it. John describes this transformation this way. All the movements, operations, and inclinations the person had previously from the principle and strength of its natural life are now, in this union, dead to what they formerly were, changed into divine movements, and alive to God. For the person, like a true daughter of God, is moved in all by the Spirit of God. Accordingly, the intellect of this person is God's intellect. Its will is God's will. Its memory is the memory of God, and its delight is God's delight. And although the substance of the soul is not the substance of God, since it cannot undergo a substantial conversion into him, it has become God through participation in God, being united to and absorbed in him as it is in this state. Thus, a union is wrought in this perfect state of the spiritual life, yet not as perfectly as in the next life. End quote. Thus, the quick and direct way to union of likeness with God is emptying ourselves of all inordinate attachments to anything, but especially to thoughts, to feelings, to images of God that would be an obstacle to God's transforming us into a more complete participation in his own life. This emptiness is that complete nakedness and freedom of spirit necessary for divine union, of which John speaks in his statement of purpose on the opening page of the Ascent of Mount Carmel. This emptying is not masochistic self-punishment, as the word self-emptying sometimes may connote. Rather, it is a gentle but firm determination to let go of all inordinate attachments to sensory pleasure, concepts, images, memories, objects, and experiences in order to dispose ourselves for God's self-communication, which transforms us into his own life. For, as St. John states, God, like the sun, stands above the person ready to communicate himself. And if God finds her empty and purified, he will enter into her and fill her with divine goods. End quote. This teaching of becoming empty for God obviously raises many questions, especially when it pertains to the emptying of the intellect and memory. As one person humorously, but I think very seriously, put it to me, I put too many years and too much money into my education to be very interested in emptying my intellect or memory. I want to hold on to everything I worked so hard for to learn. Indeed, if union with God involves the emptying of the understanding, what does this mean for religious education, where we teach about God through concepts and images? What about liturgical worship, where we pray through sensory experience, symbols, and images? What about other forms of prayer and spiritual exercises, like the Lectio Divina of the monastic tradition, or the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola, which rely heavily upon reading, memory, and imagination, and reflection, and reasoning about God? What about our own mental image of Jesus Christ and our thoughts about him? And what about our memories of intense religious experiences which provide consolation and encouragement during times of trial? Where does all of this, which is so essential to growth in religious faith, fit into John's teaching that union with God requires the emptying of the intellect, the memory, and the will. To answer this question, John teaches that God's self-revelation to us and his drawing us to divine union is done with order, gently, and according to our human nature. Specifically, God leads us to spiritual wisdom according to our ordinary manner of acquiring knowledge. Thus, through concepts learned in religious teaching, through images conveyed in worship and art, one is prepared to pass beyond sensory experience and human knowledge to the union with God, who is incomprehensible. In this way, John says, God perfects the human person gradually and according to human nature, and proceeds from the lowest and the most exterior to the highest and to the most interior. For example, children most often come to learn about God through their experience of their parents. As a father provides for his children, so God provides for the world and everyone in the world. As a mother cares for her young in their sickness, so God cares for those who turn in their needs to help. God is often pictured in art as old and bearded in order to convey divine wisdom and benevolence. Obviously, not every father is experienced as provident, nor every mother as caring. Nonetheless, by analogy, we say God provides and cares for us better than the best parents. Recently, because we recognize how culturally related to the Jewish patriarchal society the idea of God as Father is, we have begun to speak more frequently of God as Mother. We often say now, God, you who are both Father and Mother to us all, in order to express more accurately the reality of God. Yet we also recognize that even the concept, God who is Father and Mother, does not adequately convey the full mystery of God. A mature faith recognizes the validity of the human experience and concepts we use to learn about God, but at the same time realizes that the transcendent God who invites us to divine union is beyond all concept. Thus, we must continue advancing toward this union more through belief than through knowledge, through not knowing than through knowing. Another example. Some of my most intense religious experiences have happened within the sights, the sounds, the words, the songs, and the symbols of liturgy. I recall one evening prayer service at St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota. In a small, quiet chapel with soft lights, filled with the smell of incense on charcoal, we reverently chanted Psalm 141. Let my prayer arise before you like incense, the raising of my hands like an evening oblation. The whole effect of seeing the smoke arise before my eyes, smelling the sweet incense, and hearing the words of the psalm left me feeling like my entire being was being lifted in adoration to God as a sacrificial offering. Or similarly, the first time I walked into Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, with its high vaulted ceilings reaching upward and its magnificent blue windows creating a sense of sacred space, I felt my entire being swept upward to God by the effects simply of the architecture, the windows, and the arrangement of the stones upon me. Or again, in sacramental ministry, in touching persons, in the blessing of forgiveness, or in the anointing of healing, I often experience the power of God's love and healing in these human gestures. And yet, as profoundly as the presence of God is felt in these sensory actions and symbols and signs in the liturgy, I am aware that God is more than all that is imaged and experienced. And the liturgy itself acknowledged this when it prays in the 20th Sunday of the year, "O God, may we love you in all things and above all things, and reach the joy you have prepared for us, which is beyond all our imagining." Another example. In Book 2 of the Ascent of Mount Carmel, John enumerates the numerous forms of extraordinary religious experience a person may have in the journey to union with God. These include special understandings of God, visions, images and locutions, private revelations. And while he acknowledges that these can have a special role in a particular person's journey to God, his advice generally to everyone is to avoid attachment to knowledge of God gained through these extraordinary phenomena in order to journey to God in dark faith. He gives this advice for spiritual persons and their directors regarding special revelations. Quote, "Persons should be extremely careful always to reject this knowledge, and should desire to journey to God by unknowing, and always give an account of these revelations to their spiritual director, and abide by the director's counsel."
For the continuation of this presentation, please turn the cassette over. It is not necessary to fast forward or rewind the tape.